You are listening to Pop Culture Detective Audio Files. In each episode, we investigate the social and political messages embedded in popular media. I'm your host, Jonathan McIntosh, and on today's episode, we're going to be exploring a relatively new subgenre of science fiction called Solarpunk. Solarpunk is an artistic, literary, and social trend where science fiction is used as a lens to imagine new narratives about a better world. These stories and visuals focus on regenerating ecosystems, permaculture farming, mutual aid networks, and generally living in harmony with our environment. In many ways, Solarpunk is a reaction to the real-world climate crisis and also a reaction to the many post-apocalyptic visions of social collapse that fill our television screens. We'll discuss the differences between Solarpunk and other popular but more cynical genres, and we'll talk about why utopian fiction is so rare, while dystopian fantasies about the end of the world are almost ubiquitous in mainstream media. To that end, we're joined by two guests, Carl Williams and Andrew Sage. Carl is an assistant professor of clinical law at Cornell Law School. He teaches and supervises students working on legal projects and cases supporting struggles for racial justice, sovereignty, and liberation. Andrew is a writer, artist, organizer, and YouTuber, born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. He runs a popular YouTube channel called Andrewism, where he posts video essays that aim to invigorate the imagination and encourage people to create a better world in the shell of the old one through his explorations of solarpunk, anarchism, and other radical ideas. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
How you doing, John?
So I thought we'd start with just a basic overview of what solarpunk is, both in terms of a genre of fiction, but also as a social movement. And since Andrew has been making some fantastic in-depth video essays all about solarpunk over on his YouTube channel, I thought maybe you can give us a brief introduction to the concept for those who aren't familiar.
Sure. I mean, solarpunk, like you said, it's a lot of different things. It's a genre, it's an aesthetic, it's a movement, all based around this idea, this shining vision of a positive future, emphasizing the need for environmental sustainability, autonomy, and social justice. The more that I explore solarpunk, the more that I look in solarpunk and develop solarpunk, since it is still a relatively new idea, the more I recognize the spectrum that it exists on, from the most grounded interpretations to the most fanciful, but I tend to trend to the more grounded side of things. As an aesthetic, it has been fairly heavily influenced by movements such as Art Nouveau, as well as cultural art styles across Africa, Asia, and Indigenous America. It derives its name, solarpunk, from the cyberpunk genre, though you could really consider it punk in a more traditional right, which I'll get into a bit later. But it aims to go beyond what just is, and instead pursues what if, what could be, beyond the limitations of capitalism, beyond the current rift between humanity and nature. It focuses on what we should hope for, rather than on just what to avoid. And most importantly, I believe solarpunk has the potential, already partially realized, to motivate action to build the future today.
One of the many things that I like about solarpunk is that, like you're saying, it does focus heavily on what we're fighting for and less on what we're fighting against. I mean, that's there. It's part of it. It's always part of it. But I feel like for a long time, and especially in popular dystopian fiction, the what we're fighting against part has been highlighted and underlined, and we get this, it's sort of like this warning, right? This harsh warning of what will happen if we don't change our ways. And so we get that vision of societies collapsing, ecosystems collapsing, right? Mm-hmm. Zombie apocalypses and all kinds of stuff over and over and over and over again, to the point where it can feel inevitable. And solarpunk was, when I first ran across it, I was really excited, because if we are going to fight against all these terrible things, which obviously we are and we should, but what do we want instead?
Yeah.
I don't think that it's enough to say, oh, you think it's going to be bad. It's going to be way worse than you thought it was going to be. So come and join us in our movement to make it not that bad, right?
Yeah.
There's an urgency there, and they really feel it, because they're not wrong, but it's depressing. I mean, honestly, it's hard to motivate people to spend basically their entire lives.
It's demobilizing.
Yeah, it's demoralizing. It's when you're young, you can go and you can do activism every day, and you can be motivated by that anger and that, that frustration at the world. But it's not enough, I don't think.
It's not sustainable.
Right.
To get back to Solarpunk and as a cultural aesthetic and a thing that can inspire people. When punk, let's say the original punk, came on the scene, that had such a dramatic effect on people's culture in terms of politicizing people. So, just as an example, The Clash made people understand so many things about politics individually in their lives, and I think worldwide, right? Things that were going on in the world. And I think ideas that can be given to people through more digestible media instead of reading, a 600-page treatise on some political ideology, which some people do, but it's a little slower to do that. You're not going to get masses of people to do it.
It's a lot to ask somebody to join up.
Yeah,
you got to read this book and that book. Yeah.
But I think the idea of Solarpunk as a way to educate people in a soft way to say, oh yeah, that seems amazing. That's something that inspires me. That's something that excites me. That's something that makes me feel life is worth living and life is worth fighting for. And the planet is too. What are some pieces of Solarpunk that exist or that are you see coming out soon that excite you about that, Andrew?
Yeah, so I can't say that there's anything upcoming that I know of that I'm thrilled for. There are some existing works that are loosely under the banner of Solarpunk that I would definitely recommend, that I definitely find potent. I think one particular example that I really love is Walkaway by Cory Doctorow.
Yep.
Excellent piece of fiction. I would love to reread it at some point because I really do find it fantastic. I also find a lot of value in Ecotopia by Ernest Callenbach, although it is flawed in a lot of different ways and doesn't quite align with my politics. A lot of the ideas presented in terms of ways we could potentially do things differently are things that I find interesting in that text. That was written way before Solarpunk was even an idea conceived by anyone. It was written in 1970-something, I believe. There are, of course, a lot of excellent anthologies out there. Sunvault is a staple, although I haven't read it personally. I've contributed to the introduction for an upcoming Solarpunk anthology called Fighting for Future, which is edited by Phoebe Wagner. And although it is not quite the hopeful vision, I think the idea of endurance against all odds as a theme, which can be found in Solarpunk, is also present in Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. That is a very gritty text.
Yeah, it is.
They're apocalyptic in its setting and fairly contemporary. But I believe the idea it presents is somewhat fitting in a sort of a broader sense of the genre. A lot of Ghibli works or Ghibli works also get thrown under the Solarpunk label, but the only one I think really fits is Princess Mononoke in terms of its themes, in terms of its underlying message, in terms of the actual conflict present within the text. My whole thing with Solarpunk media is that I feel like a lot of people, in an effort to expand the genre and to add more stuff to the list, people see like cities with trees or advanced technology with trees, even though the actual world is quite dystopian. No shade to TV tropes, but I did see them using Zootopia as an example of Solarpunk, which I found odd.
Absolutely not.
At that point, I feel like you're pulling a muscle trying to reach it that far.
I made this video recently about Disney's Strange World and how there's some sort of Solarpunk adjacent elements, at least in the ideology of the film. And, people leave their comments. And normally I don't look.
That's experienced YouTuber practices.
Yeah. And, I have a whole long list of words that are blocked because I'm trying to weed out the worst, people. I don't want to have them clogging up the place. And I just have to check just to make sure that there's nothing really awful going on. But I did notice that lots of people would say, oh, I love Solarpunk. And then they would just list things that had nothing to do with Solarpunk whatsoever. They'd be like, yeah, The Legend of Zelda is a great Solarpunk series. And I'm like, Look, okay, I think we've missed
Pastels and trees does not make something so.
Yeah, or like everyone kept bringing up Black Panther, and it's Afrofuturism for sure.
But the only adjacently solarpunk element is some aspects of its urban planning. The actual text itself is not even close.
Yeah. There's that scene where they're walking through Wakanda and having a conversation about probably something to do with hereditary monarchy, and which doesn't fit. I mean, it just doesn't fit.
Hereditary monarchy through combat.
Right. Yeah. Supported by the CIA. So not perfect solarpunk aesthetic there in terms of the message. But yeah, I mean, you have this city and people are walking through it, and it is, at least aesthetically, kind of nice. And it's also obviously very inspiring to see that, set in East Africa. But there's also the story that it's part of, which diverges wildly from what we're talking about. And so I think people are they're very hungry for anything that could be.
That's what I was about to say. There's a very deep hunger for any kind of solarpunk media. There's this huge gap because for so long we've just been fed dystopia and cyberpunk and Blade Runner and Mad Max and etc. All these apocalypse and disaster and fallout and pain and suffering and cybernetics and mega corporations. And it's like, a lot of people just want, a walkable neighborhood and maybe some nice flora and fauna around them.
Right. I wanted to also bring up this phenomenon where even if people like the aesthetic or they're excited about solarpunk in general, I have seen some people push back on it because they're sort of been trained to be skeptical of utopia or anything that sort of even appears to be a utopia. We've been trained to reject it outright because, on Star Trek, whenever they land on the planet and it seems like it's a great, wonderful paradise, it always turns out that actually there are slave children running the machines underground, right? There's always something.
The ones who walk away from Omelas.
Exactly. Yeah. There's always some, it's always a veneer that hides something worse than what we currently have in the real world. Right. And so these sort of false utopias have been fed to us so often. A lot of people have this sort of instinctual rejection. Oh, no, it's too good to be true. It's got to be.
Yeah, there has to be some dark side,
It's got to be secretly authoritarian or something, right? And so getting through that requires more work in this kind of genre and serious work in that genre, but it also requires there to be more popular stuff that people can get over that initial freak out. Like, oh, okay, there must be something going on here that is terrible.
It feels as though people think it's more mature to slap on this sort of gritty dark side to everything. When we get in the villainous Strawberry Shortcake reboot, for example, there has to be some sort of dark side to every world. It was all in hallucination, and you see a lot of the fan theories about various Pixar properties. It tends to be this really nightmarish backstory behind it all.
There was an episode of this show, Star Trek Strange New World, which is one of the new Star Trek reboots. There's an episode where this exact thing happens. They come to what appears to be a paradise, and it turns out, of course, that in order for it to be a paradise, through some science fiction nonsense, they have to sacrifice a child every year or every couple of years for the thing to operate or have power or whatever.
And the child is Strawberry Shortcake.
Right, yes.
I'm sorry. There was
the cutest, sweetest child, yeah. And it's just so frustrating because you're like, Hollywood writers they just can't stomach it unless there's some evil secret. Because I do think it's, a healthy skepticism is important, right? Because that helps us interrogate something and,
of course,
and engage with it critically. But there's a difference between being cynical and being skeptical. Falling into cynicism and nihilism is the spiral of doom, and you got to be careful about it. But
to me, the idea of that excites me. Newly learning about solarpunk is if someone said, "Imagine a fascist totalitarian future," I can do that. If someone said, "Imagine a liberated, anarchistic, or anti-imperial future where people are free and safe and living on a sustainable earth," Much harder. Much harder. And that falls on all of us to say, like, we can't imagine that. Like, that's not something we can visualize. And this is the quote that gets attributed to a whole bunch of people that, Andrew, you talk about frequently, is that we can imagine the end of the earth, or we can imagine a zombie apocalypse, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism. But I think that that's the work of culture producers, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's also the work of, hundreds of millions of dollars in Hollywood and making, I don't know, fiascos like Waterworld or whatever, or other dystopian futures.
Yeah.
So those are easy to imagine because we've seen them hundreds and hundreds of times.
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, these sort of post-apocalyptic, cyberpunk, sort of corporate dystopias, ecological collapse, right? All of that stuff has been so ubiquitous. I mean, it is everywhere in popular media, from, Fallout, like you said, video games, movies, to TV shows, to novels and books, comics especially. And so we've been so overloaded with that. And it's, it has such high production value, a lot of it, right? So Blade Runner 2049 is a beautiful movie. I mean, visually, it is gorgeous, right? I mean, the colors and the palette and the sets and the lighting, I mean, everything about it is like enticing and exciting. And most movies that are, big budget films or TV shows or video games that are set in these post-apocalyptic worlds, they have such a high production value. It's so inviting that it makes a lot of people want to be there. It's this weird phenomenon where it's supposed to be, the story, the narrative is about failure, the failure of society, the collapse of society, right? And whether that's a corporate dystopia or an ecological wasteland, those are stories of human failure, right? They're supposed to be warnings like, we don't want this, except that it's shot and the visuals are so beautiful and so enticing that it makes people yearn for that, like almost desire the end of the world, right? And then, accompanied with those stories, of course, are these fantasies of rugged individualism, right? Where you can have your gun and your motorcycle and you can fly through the desert and, do whatever.
It's like, the worst aspects of our world turn up to 11, but also you get to be a cool hero. So, that trade-off is somewhat appealing.
Right. Society is completely gone, but, you get a cool motorcycle and a gun.
And a cybernetic arm. I mean, come on.
Right. Yeah, a cybernetic arm.
I was going to say an vibranium shield, but because if you asked most people, like, if you could be Captain America, but you have to be Captain America in World War II, so World War II has to happen again, wouldn't you do it? People would be like, wow, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. I get to be the superhero. Because in all of these movies, right, there's either an individual or a group of individuals that are...
We always visualize ourselves as the heroes, not the NPCs.
Right. Yeah. Right. So that's... And people believe that, right? They say, well, the way you change it is you individually. Because they see themselves as like, okay, like, I'm Captain America, or I'm Wolverine, or I'm Rambo, and I can save it. And then I know people who they're like 29 and they were like, oh, I was involved in like that Black liberation work, but didn't do anything. I'm like, how long did you do the work? And that really hurts me. I think it's all of our doing to try to have people understand that the idea that it's a much longer, slower struggle.
Right. What I find so interesting about Solarpunk is that it's hopeful, it's optimistic, but it's also grounded in communities, right? It's grounded in people and people's ability to come together and change our reality. It's also literally, rooted in the earth, and that usually means something slow, right? I mean, it's like growing things is a slow process.
Yeah.
When you have a garden, an orchard, whatever, it takes time, it takes nurturing. And I think that the aesthetics of Solarpunk often...
And there are setbacks.
And there are setbacks, right? Because that's
speaking from gardening experience.
Right, yeah. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes things don't take root. Sometimes there's bad weather. Sometimes, right, there's all kinds of...
Sometimes there's those damn spider mites.
Right,
etc., etc.
It's a process, and it's not a fast process. I feel like there's a sort of sexy, seductive type of revolution that gets pushed in a lot of activist circles where it's all about confrontation, right? Action. And that's all very fast and very quick and very conflict-oriented. And this is sort of the opposite of that. It sort of reinterprets revolution. Not that that stuff isn't also necessary or part of struggle, but this is another part of struggle, which gets less attention. It isn't seen as flashy and exciting because it takes time and it takes nurturing to build. And so I like that, at least in terms of the aesthetics of Solarpunk work, it sort of reflects that, but it reflects it in a way that makes it enticing. It makes it feel like you want to be there, right? Revolution, but it makes you feel good. It's less adrenaline and more relaxation. While also accomplishing this radical.
Even dare I say it's a little bit of fun.
Right. A little bit of fun.
I always think come in because the water's great, right? It actually doing that work is incredibly healthy. No matter what situation you're in, it is better for your brain to be doing that liberation justice work, environmental work. People frequently ask me how they're like, isn't it really depressing to do this work all the time? And I always think, isn't it really depressing not to? Like the not doing would be far more depressing to me.
I get that completely.
And I think that's one of the promises of Solarpunk, like showing people that.
Yeah.
There is a novella. Actually, it's not even a novella. I think it's just a short story. M.K. Jemison's Emergency Skin. And it is about a humanity, like basically Elon Musk and his friends went and colonized some moon somewhere. That society is horrifyingly dystopian. but the story takes place entirely from the perspective of someone that they've sent back to Earth to check and see if it's still there. Because, Earth was dying, so all these, all the billionaires went away. And it's about what this scout that they've sent back finds on Earth. And it's not what they expected. What they find is instead a thriving society that is very much in line, I think, with a lot of what we've been talking about. And it's a short story, but it is, I think, brilliant. And I would highly recommend it if you can find a copy of it somewhere or download it.
Sure. What's it called again?
It's called Emergency Skin, N.K. Jemisin.
Emergency Skin.
It isn't really, like we were saying, you kind of struggle to mention a mainstream movie or TV show or something that embodies all of these Solarpunk principles, right? You kind of get little glimpses here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I watched the recent Matrix movie, the fourth one. It's a post-apocalyptic world. It's the sky is black. There's no sunlight. Like, it's terrible, right? But there's like a couple moments where the machines and the humans come together and they're trying to grow strawberries. And they have Keanu Reeves like eat a strawberry and be really excited about it.
Welcome to the garden, Neo.
A strawberry?
Using digital code from the Matrix, we retro-convert it into DNA sequences.
And they grow here?
It's not easy augmenting the genome to photosynthesize biosky, but
we're getting there.
Go ahead, try it.
So there's these little tiny glimpses. That scene lasts for like 1 minute. But that is like more inspiring than most of what we get in popular culture.
Yeah.
Solarpunk is kind of like the idea of a genre that really wants to be, but isn't quite, hasn't quite taken off in terms of mainstream. But it has taken off in terms of internet culture, in terms of social media, in terms of small artists and writers who are making work. I mean, it's everywhere. It just hasn't quite broken through. And I think, the corporate structures are hesitant to take, not that they don't try sometimes to greenwash it, but it is still very, very influential, even though you can't go to the local cinema and see a Solarpunk movie in the theater, at least not yet.
And hopefully the little genre that could eventually would. And it's already happening, it's building up.
I recently read 2 books by Becky Chambers, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers. She has 2 novellas, which are called the Monk and Robot series. They were published, I think, last year, so very recent. They are about a post-capitalist society that functions, and everybody lives in harmony with the environment. And when I say that to people, they go, "Oh, well, that would be boring." But these books are not boring. And they go, "Oh, well, there wouldn't be any conflict, so that's boring." And I'm like, no. I mean, have you met a human being before? Like, human beings are really good at conflict. It doesn't always have to be, some sort of violent clash with the whole world at stake. Like, there are conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, inter-neighborhood conflicts, like conflicts everywhere. And there are all kinds of ways that people deal with them. And there's struggle, right? Even if we are beyond capitalism, there's still struggle to survive, to exist, to have relationships and to have community. Like all those things involve humans. And because we're humans, it involves some measure of conflict.
Yeah.
And so, you see that in these books where, this tea monk travels around to all the different communities and they essentially offer custom-made blends of tea for that particular person's anxieties or problems or struggles. And then they basically act as like a counselor, like an informal counselor with tea, right? And so they're traveling, like that's their vocation. And they set up their tea caravan and they put the pillows out and they make the teas and they talk to people about their problems. And it's a community service. And through those conversations, you sort of see the struggles that they're going through.
Right.
And then there's another component where there's a robot that lives in the forest that isn't supposed to exist. And they become friends and they sort of travel this world. It's fantastic. It's quiet and it's unassuming, but it isn't a world without conflict and it isn't a world without drama. And it isn't, it's just that the stakes are lower. And it's fantastical in a lot of ways, but it's comforting at the same time. This is a major, a best-selling author, a big publishing company, and it is marketed as Solarpunk. I think that's one of the first times I've seen something that I've seen the anthologies before, but like some major works being put out and promoted as Solarpunk. And, Becky Chambers' work, she has a whole other series called the Wayfarer series, which is also excellent. And I actually think has a lot of Solarpunk elements, although it happens in space and it's on these giant ships and so on. But it's all, there's lots of sustainability practices and stuff. It's extremely popular and surprisingly so, because it's sort of very human centric. And that's something that I really appreciate about Solarpunk as well, is that it's not just focused on the technology. Right? A lot of science fiction is like, well, this technology is going to be great. And then, even if it's sustainable, it's all about the technology. But Solarpunk is all about human beings, And
I think that is lost in a lot of people's engagement with Solarpunk. And I'm so glad that you put that into words. The values and principles that have the potential to be explored in Solarpunk, the human relationships, the power dynamics, the relationships between humanity and nature, all of those things, I think are far more essential to explore than just what magical technology can we come up with. When we talk about the shortcomings that I see the genre potentially get into, right? Because it is still a baby genre, and as a result, there's a lot of different directions it can go. I mean, we could talk about it as a movement, or we could talk about it as a genre, and I have thoughts on both, right? As a genre, as you mentioned, there has to be a willingness to engage with and to explore the forms of conflict that aren't, these flashy boss battles, right? To their credit, Solarpunk authors have been doing that.
Right.
There's also a need, I believe, for the genre to develop and diversify beyond this sort of uniform green aesthetic, and to actually explore how it may be interpreted and how it may evolve in different ecological and cultural contexts, right?
Right.
But my hottest take with regard to the genre that I think sets me apart from a lot of the more tech-obsessed types is that I really don't think Solarpunk is this far future, almost space opera-esque style genre. I lean more into that sort of low-tech, dirt between your fingernails kind of approach to the genre, exploring those sort of bonds between the people. And I think it needs to retain that sort of contemporary sense of this is a world that could be tomorrow, because it feeds into the movement and it feeds into the need for hope in activism. And then when you get into the sort of shortcomings of the movement, we talk about greenwashing and how it could fall prey to that. We could talk about, techno-optimism and this idea that technology is going to solve any problems we have with our relationship with nature, when, au contraire, we actually need to, fall back a few steps and step back and actually earnestly evaluate our technologies. There is this sense that, technologies are like 100% goods that we must accept and support 100%. That's not to say that I'm a rejecter of technology, but the Industrial Revolution happened kind of fast,
Right.
Within a very short space of time, considering the entirety of human existence. Cars are still a relatively recent invention, and yet we've built our entire cities around them. And then of course we're seeing AI accelerating at an almost concerning rate. So I think that our engagement with Solarpunk as it relates to technology should be less, ooh, what magical technology could we do for this? And more, how are the people in this world, in this setting, and today, as we venture forth toward a potential Solarpunk future, how are we going to engage with and adapt our existing technologies and rethink how we integrate them in our lives, in our societies, in our environments, etc.
Right.
And then, of course, the last concern that I think I had was related to this sort of soft climate change denial, this idea, again, that technology will solve the issue, but there's a need that I think Solarpunk can help with, and that is to engage with, okay, well, how do we build for the best while preparing for the worst?
Yeah, it's a very concise way of breaking it down. Any sort of artistic movement, its boundaries are porous, and it's being pushed and pulled in different directions. And to some extent, that's good because it allows for people to mold it and shape it in better ways. But there is also, like you're saying, there is the danger that corporations come and they say, "Oh, this is pretty. We want to associate our brand with a good future." I'm sure that the people who are hearing this, if they've seen my video on Disney's Strange World, I used a lot of clips from this commercial called Dear Alice, which is a yogurt commercial. It's a corporate product.
Our job is to plant seeds so our grandkids get to enjoy the fruit.
It's sort of a Studio Ghibli kind of vision of the future, beautifully animated, and they're trying to associate themselves with this vision of a better future. Now, I didn't use clips from the commercial itself. I used clips from the decommodified version. Someone on YouTube had taken it, it removed all of the branding, and so it sort of gives you all the aesthetic of this futuristic permaculture farm, but without the corporate branding. And so I used clips for that. But it is an interesting situation where we have a corporation which is trying to do one thing, and I think we all understand what that thing is. They're trying to associate themselves with something futuristic and positive, even though they are a corporate structure. And so I said in my video that I do believe it's possible for us to engage with that critically and say, okay, well, I like this vision and the inspiration that can give us, but we can also be critical of the corporate structure that's behind it, and we can understand there's no place for those corporations.
Yeah.
And that's, when you're engaging with any sort of piece of corporate media, which is impossible to avoid, and corporate media is the way that people often relate to each other and relate to the world. And so for us as people who are trying to change that world, I think it becomes important for us to engage with corporate culture in a nuanced way. We can be critical of it. We can point out, those hierarchical structures cannot exist in the future. But occasionally there are inspirational visions that kind of slip through the cracks. That to me doesn't feel like a contradiction. It feels like critical engagement.
Yeah. I mean, my position on that infamous commercial has evolved since I first used it in my work. I mean, I still find the animation studio behind it to be very talented. Shout out to them. And the commercial's aesthetic has really resonated with a lot of people and got some of them into Solarpunk. So that's definitely inspirational. But then there are discussions to be had about the content within the commercial beyond just, it's advertising yogurt.
Right.
For example, does there need to be a flying school bus in this?
Absolutely.
Solarpunk world?
Yes. Probably not. No.
And I mean, the questions like, are some of the technological applications visualized in the piece practical or necessary? Is the form of agriculture present entirely compatible with the principles of permaculture? And then, while it's a world presented in the ad that views technology and nature coexisting in harmony together, it's also questioning the premise, some of those technologies, considering the current mode of production and the wastes that it produces being externalized to negatively impact people outside of the communities that benefit most from those technologies. I mean, maybe this world circumvents this issue, but it can just as easily lull us into thinking, or rather into not even thinking about those sorts of issues in technologies, production, and development. For those who don't know what I'm referencing, most of our modern technologies rely on the mining of rare earth minerals, which are primarily found in Africa, and the people who have to mine those minerals are in slavery conditions, essentially.
Yeah.
I see that. I don't think there's anything wrong with liking the ad. You know, it's cute aesthetic, and it's fine to go off the warm, fuzzy vibes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to maintain one's hesitance toward these corporate products. It's almost insidiously powerful what could be hidden in the messaging behind some of these pieces. And I think that's why I ended up developing. I was supposed to do one last year, and I didn't end up doing one last year. I did one in 2021, and I'm doing one this year, and that is like a collaborative Solarpunk art project to sort of update the aesthetics and the visuals of Solarpunk. When I did it in 2021, my channel was a lot smaller, and since then it's gotten a bit larger. So I have quite a group of people doing it now. It's not an art competition for a reason, but I'm using the submission guidelines to sort of guide the visuals that we see shaping Solarpunk. Because up to now, a lot of the visuals are still huge skyscrapers with trees on top, and Singapore, and you know, it's not quite what the principles of Solarpunk would actually manifest as, particularly Singapore, for what should be obvious reasons.
It is, Solarpunk doesn't have the aesthetic of executing you if you have marijuana. No, that's not part of the aesthetic. When you go in the country, you literally fill out a form. It says, "We will execute you for drug crimes." It actually says that on the visa.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to jump back to a little bit, and apologies, is this idea, John, you were talking about some of the recent readings you were doing in the novellas about conflict. And I see this when people are organizing, they encounter conflict, but good and reasonable political conflict, disagreements about what should happen, disagreement about tactics and even strategies. And then they completely lose their shit. Because they say, well, you know, it's not Darkseid coming to kill us all. Why am I fighting with you? And you're like, because it's life. That is a normal thing to have a grounded political discussion about the way we approach things, about what is the most important to do, what things are less important to do, what to expend resources on, how much risk to take. And people can't, I've come up with a saying. I said, well, if you're only spending 50% of your time on internal conflict, you're probably doing pretty good. And everyone always laughs when I say that, because they were like, well, we're spending like 70%. And I tell people, like, you don't want to have that, but it is very normal to have it. And I think because of all of the media we consume, right? You watch Game of Thrones and you're like, well, if there's not 4,000 ravaging hordes trying to kill your hordes of people, then it's not a real problem and it shouldn't exist, right? So really, media makes, fiction makes us ill-equipped to deal with regular problems. And I also think this is why people, they want to have some very evil, enemy, corporation, nation state to deal with, to be like, that's the enemy and we can fight them, but we should never have any disagreement in our camp. And people are very ill-equipped to deal with that. So some of the things you were saying, if people get more experience in, this is normal. It is normal to have healthy conflict with people who are in your whatever, who believe most of the same things you believe. I think people get shocked when they say, you don't agree with 100% of the things I believe politically? How could we possibly work together?
Yeah, I mean, that's a concept I talk about in my video, Leftist Disunity. And it's something that I've had to consistently navigate, I think what people need to recognize as well is that without healthy conflict, I don't think your activism is going to be as effective, because I believe that it takes a level of vulnerability and emotional investment. And with vulnerability and emotional investment comes conflict, comes also depth in those relationships. And that depth, I think, is what creates the effective bonds that are necessary for effective activism.
Yeah. You can often come to some better or different understanding, some better or different solution that you wouldn't have found otherwise if you didn't have to navigate low stakes conflict with other people who are in your group. I mean, that process of compromise and counterproposal and proposal can get us to better solutions. So this push and pull in terms of decision making, in terms of projects, I think is it can be very healthy, but we don't learn it in school. We don't learn it at work. We don't learn it from the movies and Game of Thrones, certainly. So most of our experience with conflict in our personal and our professional lives happens within a top-down hierarchy where conflict is punished, right? And whoever has the higher position essentially makes the decision, right? They might get input, but they make the decision. So it's a very, I think a lot of people have a sort of a visceral negative reaction to the idea of conflict, because if it happens in spaces that aren't democratic or horizontal, it can be very, very unpleasant, and you can just get steamrolled. When Solarpunk or other forms of liberatory fiction can present low stakes conflict that is productive, that is constructive, I think the more that can happen, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, my engagement with Solarpunk on my channel is principally political, and to be clear, Solarpunk is not unified in its politics, but Solarpunk principles do generally lean in a very particular political direction. I mean, I don't believe that Solarpunk can stand alone. It has to be connected with anti-capitalist movements and consensus-based movements and abolitionist movements and land-back movements and DIY and permaculture movements and transition towns and decolonial struggles and workers' struggles and all these other projects for the liberation of all. Otherwise, Solarpunk is just going to be another coat of paint that corporations can co-opt to quote-unquote green capitalism.
That's actually something important, right? That Solarpunk is not just about surviving or thriving. There's political elements to it as well. There are principles of sort of horizontal, decentralized organizing that are essential, I think, to the genre.
I think, and I alluded to it earlier, what makes Solarpunk punk is its opposition to the systems of domination that exploit us now, and its pursuit of a transformation of work, community, and society as a whole. It stands against all of what we have been told about what possibilities there are. I mean, we are told that there's no alternative to the world that we have today and the systems that surround us. And so it's punk, Solarpunk is punk in the sense of hope in a world that seeks to deny it. The idea that in politics these days that imagination has no place in a pragmatic and no-nonsense world. And that's just false. We have a lot of flexibility. We're capable of a lot of different social arrangements. And if everyone limited themselves to the confines of what is, we wouldn't be where we are today. Anarchism has had a lot of influence in the Solarpunk movement. And so a lot of the principles and values that you find in anarchism, you'll also find in Solarpunk. Things like social justice and mutual aid and direct action and prefiguration. Prefiguration being the practice of establishing the relationships and systems and institutions of a desired future in the here and now. Solarpunk, of course, retains that ethos of DIY, of doing it ourselves, of taking our lives back into our own hands. It touches on food autonomy, permaculture being one of the primary ways in which people engage with Solarpunk as a lifestyle. And of course, on the more radical side of things, Solarpunk is very clearly degrowth, at least from my perspective, because it seeks to transform a society to ensure environmental justice and a good life for all within planetary boundaries, which are pretty much the exact goals of degrowth as well. Solarpunk it also asks us to fundamentally reimagine our relationship with labor and leisure. So you see a lot of intersections and overlaps between various movements and ideas that Solarpunk flirts with and is in conversation with and intersects with. When I spoke of Solarpunk throughout this episode, I spoke with these ideas forming the foundation of my understanding of the concept, recognizing, of course, it's not the only way of understanding it, but it is the understanding of it that I advocate for.
Yeah, I mean, a few of the things that you said, throughout our conversation really stood out to me, and I wanted to highlight a couple of them.
Sure.
You talked about the importance of at least a version of Solarpunk that is low tech, in that it doesn't necessarily have to be the flying school buses and the giant skyscrapers. That as part of grounding it in reality, being able to imagine how we can implement these things, permaculture systems, solar grids, power networks, but doing it locally with what we have now, right? Sort of like we're taking the green tech that we currently have and we're sort of fusing it with the worlds that we actually live in right now.
Yeah.
And it struck me that that's really important because we don't want to have a situation where we feel like we have to wait for the flying school bus before we can take off and get to the good, better world. Along with that, I was reminded that one of the things that I like about at least the versions of the Solarpunk stories that I'm drawn to are very much rooted in African and indigenous traditions around agriculture, farming tech that maybe we don't need to invent, maybe we just need to relearn that because it did exist, and then European colonization destroyed it, and sometimes destroyed the knowledge too, or at least push it to the margins. And there's a lot to sort of relearn and re-implemented.
Nick Estes, the Lakota professor, activist, organizer, water protector, the title of his book is Our History is the Future. And he's talking about the history of indigenous people in the United States and the Lakota people. And I think that the title has some of that solar punkness in it, right? That there are things that existed in the past that were to some sense in harmony with nature and humanity that existed. You should think of those things, and that is a future that we can build.
Absolutely. I was recently reading some stuff from Lila June, who's a Native American activist, and she talks a lot about what was here in terms of the United States before the waves of colonization. Because there's this idea that it was a tabula rasa, right? It was just completely wild. It was a wilderness to be tamed. And that's just not true. The whole country, or the whole continent really, was managed. There were roads, there were structures, some of them massive, there were cities, there were millions of people. And I think that gets lost in our modern retellings of that time. Along with that, all of those techniques for managing land and resources can still be, and are still extremely important and can be implemented, we know, on a large, almost, continent-wide scale because it was done before. And certainly we have new technology that we can add to that as well. But there is a lot rooted in Solarpunk that draws from past traditions, indigenous traditions that, and I think that is a core part of what makes it interesting and relevant as a genre.
Right.
I was just going to say, I read very recently, maybe as a precursor to this book, Capitalist Realism, on your suggestion, I think, Andrew, in one of your videos or multiple videos. It made me think many people who work on, let's say, Black liberation in the United States, indigenous liberation, people who work doing anti-capitalist work against war and imperialism, they say, oh yeah, well, the police are bad, but what are you going to do? It's always going to be like that. Or they say, surveillance is terrible, but it's everywhere. There's nothing we can do about it. So I just have to, deal with the fact that there's a camera on the pole outside of my house. Amazon has a Ring doorbell on everyone's front door. And there's this negativity involved in a lot of leftist thought that it's just too late, right? And if you're really leftist, you have to accept how bad that is.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, back in the early 2000s, when I first started doing organizing against the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, there became sort of this cynical orthodoxy among a lot of leftists, almost like they would try to one-up each other in terms of being more cynical, right? And that the more cynical you could be about the world that we live in, right, the more you proved your cred, which I found really counterproductive.
I find myself arguing with people and being accused of being centrist because I say there is hope, right?
Yeah.
And when I started hearing you talk about Solarpunk, I was like, okay, I'm not losing my mind. Well, maybe I am.
You haven't bought into this apocalypse theology, and that frustrates people.
I'm going to ask you this terrible question. I apologize for the question in advance, but how do I deal with someone because I get pushed into this place where I sound like I'm saying, well, it's not that bad, which really what I'm saying is historically we've done something about this. Right now we can do something about this. In the future we can and we will do something about it.
Yeah. No matter what position we find ourselves in, what situation develops materially in the future, there will always be something that we can do. Even if we reach a point where jackboots are marching down the street, there are always ways that we can eke out survival, always ways that we could keep up hope in some form and some capacity. Some people's vision of Solarpunk encapsulates this idea that with some near godly technology, we're able to just magically avert climate catastrophe entirely. I just automatically erase all of the damage that was caused in the past couple hundred years.
A little magical thinking.
That's not that's not my perspective. All power to them, but that's not my perspective. My perspective has been that this is a situation. In a lot of ways, it is going to get a bit worse, but that doesn't mean that we just roll over. That doesn't mean there aren't things that we can still do to mitigate it, to make a life worth living, to create the good life in the here and now and for the future. It's not a flashy form of revolution or activism where, we just storm the Bastille and off with their heads and all that drama. But it is, my vision of Solarpunk is really a means of not just surviving, but also thriving for ourselves, our communities, our surrounding environment.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I say when confronted with that nihilistic pessimism, I'll call it, is I say, we whittle, right? It's this slow process of organizing with people, getting together and making it a little bit less bad or trying to eke out a little bit better situation, material conditions for us and, all of our people. But that is akin to whittling. It is a slow, there's never a moment where you're like, whoa, that was a giant leap forward. You can hope for those, but rare.
Yeah, they are rare. They are moments of, rupture and moments of insurrection and whatnot. But those are rare compared to the slow burn that is the work in between those moments. And that's the work that needs to be done. I think some people who get into activism, they get caught up in the throes of the passion, and what's lost is these small contributions that are very much necessary to make a difference. Perhaps no one person can change the whole world, but each person is able to contribute to change in their communities. Each of those communities can contribute to change further and further up the chain, and that can make a real difference.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank Andrew for joining us, taking his time out of his day to enlighten us about what Solarpunk is and maybe what it isn't as well. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
And thanks for having me.
Now we're going to have to leave the conversation there, but I'll leave a whole bunch of links to everything we've discussed, including Andrew's YouTube channel, below this episode. And I'll also make sure to post those links over on the Pop Culture Detective website. Please remember that all Pop Culture Detective projects are 100% funded by listeners and viewers like you. So if you enjoy these kind of in-depth conversations about media and society, please consider going over to Patreon to support our work. Just go to patreon.com/popdetective. You can keep up to date with all of our projects on Instagram or TikTok @popdetective, and find all of our long-form video essays on the Pop Culture Detective YouTube channel. We'll be back again with another audiophile investigation, but until then, please remember to follow and subscribe wherever you happen to get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.